This is a little video to help you in case your subwoofer dies suddenly. As you know, there are many of the powered subs. They have their own amplifier inside your subwoofer. So this is how this sub looked like. So basically we had this part here, and that's what you see on the back side of the subs. There's the chassis, and then you see a nice heatsink and all the connectors to it. On the flip side of that, if you remove it from your sub, you will see that there's a nice big power transformer, and there's the input board and output board, and then you have your plate amp here, and these are the filter capacitors for its power supply, the big power diodes, and all the amplification circuitry. That's kind of like a preamp, lower signal, finer circuits, and then on the underneath you have the transistors and some dust that comes off from it after a while. So the problem with the subs is that, and all sorts of solid state amplification devices like amps and preamps, is after a while the power transistors die, so that they are underneath that thingy there, and they are fastened to this big heat sink. So that's why we need that big heat sink to move the heat away from the power transistor, which is on the underside of that board. And unfortunately, heat is the enemy of every electronics equipment. When we think about a sub, an amp, your TV, computer, everything that has a transistor, vacuum tube, or a capacitor in it, its lifespan is limited by the heat it produces. So the hotter a component runs, the sooner that component will die. And if a component dies in your equipment, if you can change it to a replacement component, then it can live on. But and that is true and easy to do for the power supply capacitors or the small bypass capacitors. It's pretty easy. You can take them off, put a new in, and even if you do not have the exact same ones to replace them, there's no difficulty in finding replacement capacitors, replacement resistors, because these are really generic things and there's like a million derivations existing. And when you tweak and tune an amp or a plate amp or your subwoofer, then you can toy around by removing the original capacitors and putting in better quality ones which have lower internal resistance, lower internal inductance, lower leakage, higher voltage rating, maybe higher capacitance, and you can play around with things. But for the power transistors, you are much more limited. And the problem with them is what also that the fact that people think that it's their advantage. So when you compare transistor gear to tube gear, people say that, I don't know, you have to change the tubes in your amplifier, I don't want to get into tubes. Wow, that's their strength as well, because it means that when they are at the end of their lifespan, you can change them. With a transistor, you are stuck. If it dies, your equipment is dead. When you have a tube amplifier, if the tube reaches end of its lifespan, then you just put a replacement tube. And you do not have to worry that there are no replacement tubes, because basically almost every single tube that has been manufactured since the turn of the century, I mean the turn of the 1900s, you can get and buy almost every single tube, or at least every tube that is in commercial amps. They are fully replaceable, and there are lots of stocks with old tubes, and there's a huge new tube production as well. So you are set for life for your kids' life and for your grandkids' life with tube supplies. That is not the case of transistors. Transistor technology changes really rapidly, and the run of transistors are usually not made for more than a couple years. So it's up to the manufacturer. If the manufacturer could get a large amount of stock of those transistors, so that they can supply the repairs of the units, then you are fine. But even after a while, especially if the product gets popular, like this Nola T-Bolt sub, which is an excellent subwoofer, then in that case, sooner or later the manufacturer will run out of replacement parts, replacement transistors, and there's no way to fix a unit. And this is what has happened to this sub, that the transistors are gone and we cannot change them to new ones. What you could do is to redesign the entire circuit board to use different power transistors, but then that's a really messy procedure, and usually not doable in most cases, unless you put in an extraordinary amount of work and maybe make a new board, but then you basically have to redesign the plate amp. And it's easier to just get a new amp instead. And so one thing to do that is that what I decided to do for this unit is to remove the plate amp. And here, when you see, this was the compartment where the plate amp was in the sub, and these are the wires that come from the woofer. These are the terminals. So I just put a jumper here, and now you can put your bananas, connect them to these wires, so this sub can be used with an external amp. So instead of using an internal plate amp, now it can be hooked to an external amp. Unfortunately, I will not be able to demonstrate it to you because it's not enough to hook it up to an amp, but you also need a crossover. And to design and build a crossover is just simply much more than I can fit in my schedule nowadays. So now the short message is that you can do this thing. So you put a connector here, and then later on you can decide whether you use it with an external amp. If you have a high quality amplifier, run it from that. It will be much better than using a built-in small plate amp. If you have a dedicated nice big amplifier, then the result will be much better. You can even, this is even a way to upgrade your subwoofer. So if you love your sub and the plate amp dies in it, then don't be too sad and don't throw it away. Just remove the plate amp and use an external amplifier with external crossover to drive it. In some subs, you can still use the plate amp as a panel and leave it inside the amp and just rewire it, so you have the wires running to the terminals. But here I couldn't do it because the terminals are not connected in here, but they are part of this circuit board. So this whole thing is just built together, and I cannot just use those wires to directly connect to those terminals. And also in the case, you can see, this is how you can tell the difference between a cheaper sub and a high quality subwoofer, that in a high quality sub, the plate amp is in a different compartment. So we do not see the driver, we do not see the insides of the sub, but the whole thing is sealed away in a separate little enclosure. And here there was one little thing, an upgrade that I did, is put Bluetech in there, because there was a little bit of leakage. So the air could go in and out in a really tiny space. So even if you have a working subwoofer, then just open it up, and if you see that there is a hole where the wires are coming out, just put a piece of blue tack to prevent the air movement from going in and out to the plate amps cabinet, to have a little better isolation and to protect the parts from that excessive pressure changes. And when you have excessive those pressure changes that your driver creates inside the sub, that pressure change will act as extra pressure on the electrolytic caps. And as we all know, if you apply pressure on the capacitor, that changes the capacitance of the capacitor. So that's why you want to protect your parts and bits from the resonances and pressure changes created by your speakers, because that directly affects the capacitance stored in the capacitors, even in the small ones. And when the capacitance changes, that also feeds back directly to the output, to the signal of your plate amp. So this is our little tip for the day, what you can do with your sub, and I hope this is really useful for a lot of people. And usually if you've been into audio for a long while, and then you probably have like an extra set of amplifier lying around, and just find a pair which has the highest power output. If it doesn't have a good top end, don't worry about it, because it will be only used for the low frequencies. And then have someone build a crossover at the input stage, so that the high frequency signals are attenuated when they reach the unit, and do not use a crossover at the output side of that amplifier, and then just connect it directly to your subwoofer. So thank you for checking in. I hope it helped you. Please like and subscribe so others can watch it and learn. Bye bye.